one of the things that I've learned from working with translators, who sometimes have impossible questions.
Yeah.
My Chinese translator, who is Joni Mitchell, and what is a cookie?
In that order?
You got me there. Or even like a Finnish translator, driving onto the Mad American Night, which is, even if you don't know that that's from Kerouac, as an American, you get the fantasy about Bruce Springsteen. It's the idea that there is something else out there, and you could just get in a big car and give it all up and drive past the horizon line. And I just thought, I bet there's no Mad Finnish night to drive out into. Is there now? And furthermore, if you are Finnish, the idea of driving toward the horizon probably has a very different and darker connotation than this kind of great American optimism and the idea that I can always be a bartender in a Mexican restaurant someplace. Which has led me to understand that this is where it semi fits, because we are writing books that come from books. Where translation is concerned, I've come to realize that it's all translation. The original text is already a sort of not quite right translation of the greater book you had floating in the cartoon balloon over your head. And then if a Chinese translator or a Finnish translator struggles further with it, that's just another stop along the spectrum.
That's interesting.
At its inception, it's a sort of slightly faulty translation.
It's a great thought. As someone who has done a translation, that certainly speaks to me. Well, because I always like to say that there's no. When you're a critic, you're always trying to get into the head of the writer that you're writing about and to understand what she's doing. But there's no kind of intimacy greater than when you're translating someone. Precisely because of what you're saying about the Finnish night versus the American night, because you have to, and I guess this brings me back to my earlier question, you have to be bold enough to try to imagine what they were thinking when they said something, so you could think the same thing but say it in your own language. And it's a kind of knowing a writer, to translate a writer. It's an incredibly intimate kind of knowledge.
And Cavafy,
of all people. Of all people.
Could you? I would love to hear something about translating a poet who's also a great poet, writing in Greek.
Well, it's, like my grandmother used to say, man plans and God laughs. And I sort of got into that project by accident, almost. I knew a guy who was a photographer who was doing a series of photographs based on, or as he thought, based on Cavafy's poems, and he wanted just new translations for wall text. And so he asked me to do a few, and that's how I got into it. But there's nothing scarier than, well, as you know from working on Woolf, right, that when you're in the presence of a really great literary mind, it's humbling, It's really humbling in a nice way. It's not like, oh, I'm nothing and they're everything, but it's just like, you think you're going to do all kinds of great things. I'm sure every translator has this experience, you think you're going to be so much smarter than all the other translators. And in fact, you get more and more respectful of what other people have done, because you realize how incredibly difficult it is when faced with really wonderful writing to do something, to do anything with it. And what I always like to say is, Cavafy, when he first started, he wasn't really that good. He was, partly because he was sort of hiding his gayness. And, there's all these early poems addressed to beautiful Turkish ladies, and they're all just preposterous and terrible. But the point of this story is they're much easier to translate. It's much easier to translate bad writing. That was my great lesson that I learned. No, but I'm not joking, and it tells you something, because it's everything that's there is apprehensible, right?